Noah was a king in southern Sumer, and it looks as though his flood was a flood round about 4,250 BC, which was what we call the climatic optimum, the highest temperatures reached in that Holocene period, the wholly recent period.
Yes.
And so we have people like Plato talking, and Solon going to Egypt and being told by Sontius that there were many floods and many diverse movements of stars and objects. And if we piece this jigsaw puzzle together, as people have done and are now doing, we're beginning to build up a clearer profile all the time of what has happened. And I hope we'll be able to fill all the pieces in together to get a very clear picture of our incredible ancestors and what they actually had to go through, and how a small group of survivors started all over again. And we've been surviving on their knowledge and their success for 10,000 years.
This is fascinating. And, we got to clarify at this point also that O'Brien then was one of these scholars who were reading cuneiform and knew the language, right? And he had a kind of as you mentioned a little bit there, a different interpretation than the majority, so to speak, will be familiar, and that will be the kind of Sitchin version of the story, so to speak.
That's right. He found that Professor George Barton, who was a wonderful man, but he was conditioned by religion and like us all, found themselves in a religious straitjacket because we're not exactly brainwashed, but we are taught in a certain way, depending on our family or whatever.
Yes.
Either as Islam or Jewish or whatever. And the problem with Professor George Barton, he looked at these records and thought that they were incantations and hymns. Well, they weren't incantations and hymns. They were extremely sensible, practical, straightforward records of what had happened to practical people. Now, Abraham was a very practical person. He had to deliver discoveries of oil. He had to rewrite geology books. He wrote a book which gave great detail on how far the Rocky Mountains had moved over the last 40 million years, which was crucial to find out where oil was and where the drilling should take place.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when he met Barbara Joy O'Brien's father, whom I call my Uncle Pat. Uncle Pat said, as he would to any young man, although Christian Brown was about 40 at that time, he said, "What do you do, young man?" And he said, "I'm working out how far the Rocky Mountains have moved in the last 30 million years." And of course, he had been doing that. and it was that kind of skill. But what he did, which was special, and this is a point that all good cuneiform translators now realize, is that you have to go back to what we now know as the original Indo-European picture and symbol language, which evolved from pictures into the cuneiform. It also evolved into the Egyptian hieroglyphs and the Indus Valley script and the other scripts we find all around the world, the talking board scripts.
Yes.
So there was a common picture language, very good spatial memory. People are very good at it. If I want to come and drive to Sweden, I can find the same arrows and signs in France and England as I find in Sweden. These are the spatial things which
Yes.
we're very good at doing.
Yes.
And so the ordinary people were given the spatial language. But back to good old Ashburnapal in his library, he said that he could read the language from before the flood. Now, what he was talking about was the alphabetic text, which was always in-house to the kings and the advisors to kings and was taught at the kingship schools. So when Ashburnipal, who was a candidate for kingship, he'd been selected as a bright young man who would be a good king, because that's the way they did it then, he, in fact, had learnt at the kingship school the alphabeg, or alphabetic text, which went back many thousand years, probably to very early times. And that was the in-house writing and symbol, which we find the Druids using in-house, but they didn't shout about it, so to speak. And so it's very important for people to realize that the picture and symbol language was for the ordinary people, and that in-house they always had a speedy writing, as it's described by Enoch, which was the alphabetic text. And one of the difficulties here is that the Hebrew and the Aramaic never made use of the vowels. They could have done, and they should have done, but they produced a codified version of the Phoenician alphabet. And that codified version has been incredibly difficult to translate through what is called parasynonymy, which means that the meaning of a word or a phrase, you have to know what it's all about to be able to correctly translate it. So you have maybe 6 different translations depending on the context in which maybe 4 or 5 words are used. And this has led to so much difficulty. We have to get away from the Hebrew and Aramaic if we want to really know what went on, and move back to the Egyptian and move back to the cuneiform. And in order for O'Brien to accurately translate these texts, he had to start with the picture language, which the scribes had turned on its side and then stylized in their own particular way. So it became necessary to employ a scribe to tell you what was going on.
That's interesting. And, so let's talk a little bit about some of the stories and the context here on what they were talking about. We know at this point then that according to this, there was big catastrophe. We can see evidence of this. We don't have time in this program right now to go into all of the physical evidence. There are, numerous things that we can look at upon the earth itself that obviously supports this theory. But let's look at the stories here, the storytelling, the mythology, if you will, of this. And so we know that there was a great catastrophe, and then we have a handful, and you can tell us here how many, of course, but we have a few survivors from this time. We have a few survivors that were keeping this knowledge alive, so to speak, and consequently was teaching the other people about their knowledge. Tell us a little bit about these and who these survivors were.
The best evidence now is that at that time, it was the largest mass extinction for 3.5 million years. We had giant horses, we had saber-toothed tigers, we have rhinoceros, we have so many different types of elephants in the Americas, horses in the Americas. The record is absolutely extraordinary, and that is one of the marvelous jobs that Allen and Dallaire have done in their book, Catastrophe. So we know it was absolutely horrifying, and the whole earth was crumpled and moved, and we find that the Rift Valley which runs from Turkey down to Malawi and nearly into South Africa, the Great Rift Valley, the Alps, the Himalayas, the Tibetan Plateau, all were moved either sideways or upwards. And at the same time, we have many parts of the world sinking by enormous amounts. I thought that 2,000 feet looked crazily large, but then Allen and Dallaire are talking about massive movements vertically of the Earth's crust in the region of New Zealand, which were almost unbelievable. And we had a major sea in the middle of the Sahara, much of Siberia, the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea, right to the Aral Sea, was one great big sea. And the way in which our planet looks was totally different to the way it looks now. And I advise anybody to just look at this geological record. We have so much debris washed into caves, which includes human bones, animal bones, trees, organic material of all kinds. And it was something which is just very difficult to describe. Somehow, a group of people, and we have stories right through North America, South America, and other parts of the world, of the god or the creator god or the senior people around had told the ordinary people or the tribal people, whatever, go dig a hole, cover it with logs and earth and hide, because we're going to have a big problem. And presumably the people who were able to pass that message around the planet had very good facilities themselves, like a massive platform which they could go under, which was going to be dry, where they were extremely well protected, and rooms and stonework, etc., reminiscent of the Baalbek platform, the Mount Moriah platform in Jerusalem, the Persepolis platform, and many other platform structures around the world, which are on that archaeological record, but perhaps not noticed for what they really are. We also have, remember, much later times, we have the construction of dolmen and megaliths of all kinds, and even in Turin's in the area of the Aegean Sea, we find megarons, which are internal rooms, which are safe places to go when the sky is falling or when cometary debris is coming into the system.
Yes.
Much the same as every house in Switzerland, I think, is under obligation to have a cellar or a building which does the job of an A-bomb shelter now. So we have to rethink and reassess the fact that much of the early these structures were to protect people, rather like Anderson shelters in the war, we call them in Britain. But certainly people had to reconstruct something that worked like a cave and had good drainage for what the solar system was throwing at us. And so out of all that, we find a small group of survivors, literally seven archangels, as they're called, Anu and Enlil, and we can identify amongst them An as a single leader of the Anunnaki, and the Anunnaki is a word we've used Anunnaki, in fact, by the archaeologists in Sumer. It isn't a Sitchin invention. And we've got to be able to look and realize that An, or Anu, An was the senior Sumerian god. They knew exactly who their god was. And we have An and Enlil and Ninkar-Sag, who was the governor of the Garden of Eden, the bright spark, the lady biologist who worked with Enki, who was Enlil's brother. And we get back to that story, which matches the similar stories that Zecharia Sitchin is talking about. And Zecharia Sitchin has played a major role, a helpful role, I think. And he was, to a certain extent, having to work on all this material. And we really owe a great debt to him in what he has done, even though perhaps some of us may feel that over time the new evidence that we have means that much of his material needs looking at again.
Yes, indeed. And, one thing we can mention here right away also is, or discuss a little bit about that, is where these come from, of course. I mean, Sitchin takes this off-planet, but as I understand it from your research and consequently also O'Brien's research, then that we don't have to go off-planet to describe these seven archangels, as you said. Tell us a little bit about what you believe, they came from first, so to speak.
Well, with a catastrophe of this size and a supernova explosion, it's pretty clear that the whole of our galaxy, which centers on the Milky Way, our galaxy, and planets in our system would have been dramatically affected by this enormous catastrophe. It may be that Mars lost its atmosphere around the same time. It would be probable that all the other structures in our galaxy would have been very seriously affected. And if there was life on other planets in our galaxy or neighboring galaxies, then there is always a suggestion here that those people may have had to consider starting again. But I think one of the major clues is what we know about our atmosphere. We know that a large chunk of the Earth's atmosphere was destroyed at this point in time. We have these extraordinarily large animals on the fossil record. And the research, which I understand is being undertaken now, particularly in water tanks, where you can recreate an atmospheric conditions, which we had at the end of the Ice Age, they're finding that they are able to, species we know well, are growing to twice their normal size and living twice as long in a more dense atmosphere. That is a clue. When we hear about giants or tall people, that is a clue that some of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, were larger than us. We talk about Cro-Magnon being 6 feet, 6'6", but we've also got a lot of evidence of people being much taller than that. And an explanation for that is that they were